Did medieval women just sit around waiting for nights where their lives only about embroidering babies? Did they have any say in the big decisions of their world from the 5th to the 15th centuries? Or number 7. They were just pretty faces in the background making no waves. This notion suggests medieval women were passive, ornamental figures entirely detached from any real influence or action. It implies their roles were limited to domestic duties, looking pleasant, or serving as pawns in dynastic marriages without any personal agency or direct involvement in the turbulent political currents of their time. The idea is that powerful men made all the moves, and women merely observed from the sidelines, their contributions to society and governance negligible. This common thought often paints a picture of silence, submission, and a complete absence of public voice for women across the social spectrum, from queens to peasant wives. It suggests that the medieval world was an almost exclusively male domain when it came to any form of decision-making beyond the household, with women primarily serving as symbols rather than active participants. They were thought to be confined by custom, law, and expectation to a purely private realm, their opinions unheard and their ambitions unfulfilled in the grand tapestry of medieval power struggles. Even when mentioned in historical texts, the belief often persists that these mentions were fleeting, their roles secondary, and their presence largely symbolic rather than substantive. Yet, records from the 12th century reveal a woman like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who inherited the vast duchy of Aquitaine in southern France at 15, making her one of the most powerful feudal lords in Europe. She was not merely a decorative queen consort to two kings, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England. Eleanor possessed immense wealth and a territory larger than the King of France's direct domain. She actively governed Aquitaine, hearing cases, issuing charters, and collecting taxes. During her first marriage, she joined the Second Crusade, traveling to the Holy Land, where her presence and influence were noted. She was known to hold her own court, attracting poets and scholars, fostering a culture of chivalry and patronage that shaped the literary landscape of her era. Later, she openly supported her sons, including Richard the Lionheart, in their rebellions against their father, Henry II, leading to her imprisonment for many years. Upon Henry's death, she was released and acted as a powerful regent for Richard while he was on crusade, securing his succession and dealing with political crises in England and France. In her old age, she continued to wield diplomatic influence, traveling across Europe to arrange marriages for her grandchildren, securing alliances for the Plantagenet dynasty. Her charters often bear her seal, her signature alongside the king's, a direct assertion of her authority. Centuries later, in the early 15th century, Christine de Pizan, a widow and mother, broke the mold of medieval women's presumed silence by becoming Europe's first professional female writer. She earned her living by her pen, writing for nobles and royalty. Christine did not shy away from political commentary. Her works, like The Book of the City of Ladies, openly defended women against misogynistic attacks prevalent in literature, but she also wrote directly on political matters. In the Book of Peace, she offered advice on good governance to the young King Charles VI's son, advocating for justice, peace, and stable rule. She wrote about the tumultuous political landscape of France during the 100 Years' War, urging reconciliation and effective leadership. Her voice was not hidden or indirect. It was published, read, and intended to influence. She engaged in public discourse, arguing with prominent male intellectuals over time, showing a boldness that went far beyond mere decoration. Her very act of writing and publishing was a political statement, demonstrating intellectual agency and a desire to contribute to public welfare and governance. Another striking figure is Blanche of Castile, who served as regent for her son Louis IX, after the death of her husband, Louis VIII, in 1226. Her regency was no gentle, symbolic affair. Blanche faced formidable challenges, including powerful feudal lords who resented a strong central monarchy and the regency of a woman. She actively led royal armies to crush rebellions, notably the coalition of rebellious barons in 1227 and 1228. She proved herself a shrewd diplomat, negotiating the Treaty of Paris in 1229, which brought an end to the Albigensian Crusade and secured important territorial gains for the French crown, extending royal control over southern France. Blanche managed the royal finances, oversaw the judicial system, and meticulously educated her son, preparing him to rule effectively. Contemporary chroniclers, often biased against female rulers, begrudgingly acknowledged her strength and competence. She even dealt with papal legates and communicated directly with the Pope, demonstrating her standing on the European political stage. Her hands-on approach to governance, her military leadership, and her diplomatic achievements were not the actions of someone merely in the background. Consider Isabella of France, a daughter of the French king Philip IV and wife of King Edward II of England in the early 14th century. She was not content to remain a passive queen. When her husband's favoritism towards various male courtiers led to political instability and her own marginalization, Isabella took matters into her own hands. She traveled to France under the guise of a diplomatic mission, but her true purpose was to gather support against Edward. There she openly allied with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English nobleman, and together they orchestrated an invasion of England in 1326. Isabella personally led forces, garnered popular support, and successfully deposed her husband, placing their young son, Edward III, on the throne. She effectively ruled as regent for her son for several years, making key political decisions and managing the kingdom's affairs. Her actions were audacious and direct, demonstrating a willingness to challenge established power structures and execute a coup that reshaped the English monarchy. Even outside the highest echelons of royalty, abbesses in the Holy Roman Empire wielded significant temporal power. Figures like Matilda of Quedlinburg, who served as abbess from 999 to 1011, governed vast territories, commanded vassals, raised armies, and even minted their own coins. These women were not spiritual leaders alone, they were feudal lords in their own right, directly participating in imperial diets and political gatherings. They issued charters, sat in judgment, and managed large estates that were economic powerhouses. Their positions were often inherited or appointed based on their noble birth and political connections, allowing them to exert influence far beyond the walls of their abbeys. These abbesses navigated complex political landscapes, balancing loyalty to the emperor with the needs of their own territories, demonstrating a direct, active form of governance that directly contradicts any notion of women being merely passive spectators. Number 6. Their power was only ever borrowed, never truly their own. This notion suggests that any political influence medieval women might have exercised was merely a temporary reflection of their male relative's status as a husband, father, or son. It implies that women could never hold power independently, but rather served as conduits or proxies for male authority. Their property, their titles, and their decisions were seen as ultimately subordinate to male control, always subject to revocation or manipulation by men. This perspective holds that medieval society, with its deeply patriarchal structures, simply did not allow for a woman to be a source of legitimate, independent power, making their every act of influence an extension of a male figure's will rather than their own. It suggests that if a woman appeared powerful, it was because she was acting on behalf of a man, or because circumstances had forced her into a role for which she was not inherently suited, and from which she would be removed as soon as a suitable male heir or guardian appeared. Their land, their decisions, even their very political identities were thought to be perpetually on loan. However, medieval legal and social structures, while often patriarchal, offered avenues for women to possess and exercise power independently. In many parts of Europe, particularly among the nobility, women could inherit land and titles in their own right, especially in the absence of male heirs. A woman who inherited a barony or a duchy became the feudal lord, complete with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. She held the land, received homage from her vassals, dispensed justice in her courts, and owed feudal service to her own overlord, perhaps even to the king. She controlled the economic output of her lands, managed its finances, and determined its administrative policies. And her power was not borrowed. It was hers by right of inheritance, a legal fact of the medieval world that allowed women to be significant landowners and political players directly. For instance, women could hold their own castles, command their own garrisons, and even lead their own retinues. The concept of dower, a portion of her deceased husband's estate set aside for a widow's lifetime support, often granted women significant economic independence. This dower land was hers to manage and profit from, even if it reverted to her husband's family upon her death. For noble women, this could mean control over substantial estates, revenues, and the tenants who lived on them. A wealthy widow, independent of male control, could make her own choices about her household, her finances, and even her political allegiances. She could act as a patron, engaging in building projects, founding religious institutions, or supporting artists. Her economic clout translated directly into political influence, allowing her to negotiate alliances, influence local governance, and even choose whether or not to remarry, a decision with significant dynastic implications. The dower was not borrowed, it was a legally guaranteed right that gave many widows true autonomy and power. Abbesses, as mentioned earlier, ruled their convents and their associated lands with an independence that was often comparable to that of male bishops or feudal lords. The Abbey of Quedlinburg, for example, was an imperial immediacy, meaning it answered directly to the Holy Roman Emperor, not to any intermediate lord. Its abbess, a woman, held significant sway in imperial politics, sometimes attending imperial diets, which were assemblies of the empire's most powerful princes and ecclesiastical leaders. She did not attend as a representative of a male figure. She attended in her own right as a prince of the empire. She had her own court, her own administration, and her own military contingent. Her authority derived from her office, an office that was traditionally held by a woman and granted extensive political and economic rights. This was not borrowed power, but institutional power vested in the person holding the position. In urban centers, particularly from the High Middle Ages onward, women, especially widows or unmarried women, could own businesses, join guilds, and participate in urban economic life independently. While guilds often had restrictions on women's full membership, many women ran shops, taverns, and workshops, particularly in textile production, brewing, and food preparation. A woman who owned property within a city, who managed her own trade, and who employed workers, held a significant degree of economic power. This economic independence often translated into a social and political voice within the community. For example, some city records show women appearing in court on their own behalf, signing contracts, and engaging in commercial lawsuits, asserting their legal and economic agency directly. They were not always reliant on a male guardian or representative for these actions. Their independent status as property owners or business operators granted them the right to act on their own behalf, making their power unequivocally their own. Their legal systems, while diverse, also reveal spaces for independent female agency. While coverture laws in some regions like England largely subsumed a wife's legal identity into her husband's, other regions, especially in parts of France and Italy, offered married women more control over their dowry and personal property. A woman's dowry, which she brought into the marriage, often remained her separate property, and, in many cases, she could control its use and disposition even during her husband's lifetime. This meant she held a significant financial asset that could be used for her own purposes or as leverage within the marriage. In the event of her husband's death, the dowry typically reverted to her or her heirs, reinforcing her economic independence. This control over personal wealth provided a direct source of power, not merely a borrowed one. She could use her dowry to secure her family's position, influence her children's marriages, or even engage in charitable endeavors, all through her own financial decisions. Number 5. Only queens and empresses ever mattered in politics. This notion presents a narrow view of political influence, suggesting that power was exclusively concentrated at the very apex of society, within the royal courts, and that only women directly married to or born into supreme rulership could ever hope to exert any meaningful sway. It implies that the vast majority of medieval women, even those from noble or wealthy backgrounds, remained outside the spheres of decision-making, their lives entirely unconnected to the broader political currents of their regions or the continent. This idea overlooks the intricate web of feudal relationships, local governance, and economic power that defined much of the medieval world, assuming a top-down, centralized model of political action that rarely existed in practice. It discounts the roles played by women in maintaining social order, managing vast resources, and shaping local policies, believing that only the grand dramas of kings and emperors held true political weight. The thought is that if a woman wasn't literally sitting on a throne, or married to someone who was, her impact on society and governance was negligible. However, the political landscape of the Middle Ages was far more decentralized and complex than this narrow view suggests. Noble women, even if not queens, often held considerable political power through their control of vast estates, their roles as castellan, and their positions within the feudal hierarchy. When their husbands were away on crusade, at war, or at the royal court, noble women were frequently left in charge of managing the family lands. This involved administering justice, collecting rents and taxes, overseeing agricultural production, and maintaining military readiness. They were often responsible for defending castles during sieges, negotiating with neighboring lords, and ensuring the loyalty of their vassals. For example, during the anarchy in 12th century England, when Empress Matilda and King Stephen vied for the throne, many noblewomen actively participated in the conflict, defending their castles and managing their family's interests in a time of widespread political upheaval. Their influence was not merely domestic. It was directly tied to land, resources, and military strength, forming the bedrock of regional power. Beyond the nobility, powerful abbesses, as discussed, functioned as independent political entities. The Abbess of Gandersheim, for example, like her counterpart in Quedlinburg, wielded significant temporal power, controlling extensive territories and holding a direct relationship with the Holy Roman Emperor. These women were not just religious figures, they were political players who attended imperial assemblies, advised emperors, and engaged in diplomatic negotiations. They granted charters, levied taxes, and maintained their own judicial systems. Their political influence stemmed from their control over vast landholdings and the loyalty of their vassals, making them key figures in the political fabric of the German Empire. Their power was not borrowed from a king or emperor, but derived from their office and the wealth and authority of their institutions, making them integral, independent actors in the imperial landscape. In burgeoning urban centers, women, particularly widows or unmarried women, could exert significant political influence through their economic power. Many women ran successful businesses, participated in guilds, and owned valuable property within cities. In places like Florence or London, wealthy merchant women and master craftswomen often held significant sway in local economic and social affairs. Their financial contributions to city coffers, their ability to employ many people, and their social networks gave them a voice in urban politics. They might not have held formal political office, but their ability to fund civic projects, influence trade regulations, or support specific candidates for city councils gave them real, tangible political power at the local level. These women often appeared in city court records, pursuing their own legal cases or acting as witnesses, demonstrating their active participation in the legal and administrative life of their communities, a far cry from being politically irrelevant. Even at the lowest levels of society, peasant women had some forms of collective political voice, often exercised through village communities and manorial courts. While these were not high-level political bodies, they were the immediate arenas of power for ordinary people. Women appeared in manorial court roles, bringing complaints, defending themselves against accusations, or testifying in disputes. They participated in customary practices that governed village life, land use, and resource allocation. While individual peasant women might not have wielded immense personal power, their collective voice in challenging oppressive lords, asserting communal rights, or resisting unfair demands formed a vital, albeit often overlooked, part of the medieval political landscape. These interactions, recorded in surviving court documents, show women actively engaging with the structures of power that directly impacted their daily lives, demonstrating that political participation was not solely the preserve of queens. Furthermore, within many aristocratic households, the lady of the castle or manor played a crucial political role in maintaining the household's network of alliances and loyalties. She managed the vast domestic staff, hosted important guests, and supervised the education of children who were future heirs and political actors. Her hospitality and social skills were essential for forging and maintaining alliances, distributing patronage, and gathering intelligence. While seemingly domestic, these activities were deeply political, ensuring the smooth functioning of the noble family's power base. She often served as a vital link between her husband and his vassals, or between her family and other noble houses. These women often acted as intermediaries, diplomats, and power brokers within their social sphere, wielding influence through their social standing and their networks, even without a crown on their head. Number 4. All medieval women lived under constant, absolute male control. This notion paints a picture of uniform oppression, suggesting that every woman in the medieval period, regardless of her social standing, geographic location, or the specific century she lived in, was perpetually and absolutely subject to the will of a male relative. It implies a monolithic patriarchal system that allowed no exceptions, no autonomy, and no spheres of independent action for women. This perspective often overlooks the nuances of medieval law, custom, and social practice, which varied greatly across different regions and different social classes. It assumes a complete lack of agency or negotiation for women, as if their lives were entirely predetermined by male authority figures from birth to death, with no capacity for individual choice or the assertion of personal rights. This oversimplified view ignores the complex interplay of power dynamics within families, communities, and legal systems. However, the reality of medieval women's lives was far more diverse and nuanced than this singular narrative of absolute male control suggests. Legal systems across Europe were not uniform. While English common law, for instance, heavily emphasized coverture, where a married woman's legal identity was largely subsumed by her husband's, other legal traditions offered different possibilities. In parts of medieval France and Italy, civil law and local customary laws often provided married women with more distinct legal rights, particularly regarding their property. A woman's dowry, brought into the marriage, often remained her separate property, which she could control and, in some cases, even manage independently of her husband. She could use it to fund her own projects, influence family decisions, or ensure her financial security in widowhood. This control over a significant financial asset provided a foundation for a degree of autonomy that directly challenged the idea of absolute male control. Social class also played a crucial role in determining the extent of a woman's autonomy. While peasant women certainly faced harsh realities and depended heavily on their male relatives for survival and protection, they also played an indispensable role in the agricultural economy. They managed households, raised livestock, cultivated gardens, and often worked alongside men in the fields. This economic contribution gave them a degree of leverage within the household and the community. Their labor was essential and their skills were valued. For example, records show peasant women inheriting land, owning property, and even appearing in manorial courts to defend their rights or participate in local governance, suggesting a recognition of their individual legal standing, even if limited. Their daily lives involved constant negotiation and collaboration rather than mere passive obedience. Their noblewomen, particularly those who were widows or unmarried, often enjoyed remarkable autonomy. A widow, freed from the legal constraints of marriage, regained her independent legal status. She could manage her dower lands, dispose of her property, and choose whether or not to remarry. Many powerful noble widows, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine in her later years, or Blanche of Navarre, Queen of France, acted as independent feudal lords, governing vast territories, issuing charters, and engaging in diplomatic negotiations. Their independence was not merely theoretical, it was exercised in the active management of their estates, their participation in political affairs, and their ability to shape the future of their families and lands. They were not controlled by a male relative, they were often the controlling figures themselves. Their regional variations in medieval society further complicate the narrative of universal male control. In some parts of Scandinavia, for example, women generally enjoyed greater legal and social freedoms compared to their counterparts in other parts of Europe. They had more extensive inheritance rights, could initiate divorce, and participate more directly in public life. Similarly, in some Italian city-states, wealthy urban women, particularly widows, could run large businesses, act as financiers, and participate in trade, sometimes even holding positions of influence within their guilds or civic life. These regional differences highlight that the degree of male control was not a monolithic constant across the medieval world, but varied significantly based on local customs, laws, and economic structures, offering women different pathways to agency and independence. Even within marriage, the dynamics were not always simply one-sided. While husbands held significant authority, medieval households were often partnerships, especially in the practical management of estates or businesses. Wives were often deeply involved in running the household economy, managing servants, overseeing finances, and acting as their husband's deputies when he was absent. For example, when a lord was away on campaign or at court, his wife often managed the entire estate, making crucial decisions about crops, tenants, and defense. This practical necessity often granted women significant de facto authority and influence within their families and communities, an influence that was built on competence and necessity rather than absolute male dictate. Women were not merely objects of control, but active participants in the economic and social life of their families and communities, capable of asserting their will and shaping their destinies within the available frameworks. Number 3. Their political influence was always sneaky and hidden, never out in the open. This notion often conjures images of medieval women whispering advice in their husband's ear, manipulating events from behind closed doors, or using their charm and social networks to achieve their aims indirectly. It suggests that women's political participation was deemed illegitimate or inappropriate if conducted openly, forcing them into covert operations and subtle maneuvers. The idea is that medieval society fundamentally rejected the public display of female power, consigning women to the shadows of influence, where their actions were always discreet and their involvement never formally acknowledged. This view assumes a universal aversion to women in public roles, making any direct assertion of authority by a woman a scandalous or unusual event, something to be hidden rather than celebrated or accepted. It implies that a woman's political agency could only be expressed through subtle, often feminized means, far removed from the formal processes of governance. However, historical records are filled with instances of medieval women exercising political influence in overtly public, recognized, and often official capacities. One of the most striking examples is the role of the regent queen. When a king died leaving a minor heir, it was common practice for his widow or mother to assume the regency, governing the kingdom openly and with full authority. Blanche of Castile, regent for Louis IX of France, as discussed earlier, did not rule from behind a curtain. She held court, issued royal decrees, led armies, negotiated treaties with foreign powers, and received ambassadors. Her regency was a public and legitimate exercise of royal power, recognized by the nobility, the church, and the populace. The Empress Theophanu, regent for her son Otto III in the Holy Roman Empire from 985 to 991, similarly governed with full imperial authority, traveling across the empire, issuing charters, presiding over assemblies, and leading diplomatic missions. Her actions were not secret, but the very visible essence of imperial rule. Women also engaged in diplomacy and international relations in a very public way. Queens and noblewomen often served as key figures in negotiating marriage alliances, which were crucial political tools in the medieval world. These negotiations were complex, involving land, wealth, and strategic advantages. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine traveled extensively to arrange marriages for their children and grandchildren, acting as direct representatives of their dynasties. They met with foreign rulers, discussed terms, and secured agreements, all in the open arena of international politics. For example, Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England, traveled to France in 1445 to arrange her marriage to Henry VI, a negotiation that involved significant political concessions and alliances. These were not hidden discussions but formalized diplomatic missions where women acted as principal agents. Beyond regencies and diplomacy, some women held direct institutional power in public roles. Abbesses of powerful imperial abbeys, such as Quedlinburg or Gandersheim, attended imperial diets and advised emperors. These were formal assemblies of the empire's most powerful secular and ecclesiastical lords, where policies were debated and decisions made. The presence and participation of these abbesses were expected and recognized, not surreptitious. They signed official documents, acted as witnesses to important charters, and participated in legal proceedings in their capacity as feudal lords, exercising authority in the full view of their peers and subjects. Their involvement in these high-level political gatherings was a testament to their accepted and overt political standing. Noblewomen, in their capacity as landowners and castellans, often presided over manorial courts, administering justice for their tenants and vassals. While these were local courts, they were public forums where disputes were resolved, crimes prosecuted, and customary laws upheld. A lady of the manor sitting in judgment, hearing petitions, and issuing rulings was a common and visible exercise of power within the feudal system. They also issued charters and grants related to their lands, actions that were public and legally binding documents, openly asserting their authority over property and people. The defense of castles during sieges also required women to take on public military command roles, directing defenses and negotiating terms with attackers, all of which were highly visible and direct acts of political and military leadership. Even the political writings of women like Christine de Pizan, which were commissioned by and presented to rulers, were not secret documents. They were intended for public consumption within the courtly and intellectual circles of the time. Christine's critiques of society, her advice on governance, and her defense of women were openly circulated and discussed, intended to influence public opinion and the decisions of those in power. Her very existence as a professional writer commenting on political matters was a public phenomenon, challenging the idea that women's voices were confined to private whispers. These examples collectively demonstrate that medieval women were frequently active, visible, and formally recognized participants in the political sphere, far from merely operating in the shadows. Number 2. They existed solely in the domestic sphere, far from power centers. This notion confines medieval women strictly to the household, suggesting that their lives revolved entirely around domestic chores, childcare, and the management of their immediate family's living space. It implies that their world ended at the threshold of their home, and that they had no engagement with the broader economic, social, or political life of their communities, towns, or regions. This view separates the domestic sphere from the public sphere in a way that often did not apply in the Middle Ages, particularly for noble and wealthy women. It disregards the fact that in a predominantly agrarian society, the household was often the fundamental unit of production and governance, and that women's roles within it frequently extended into what we would now consider public life. The idea is that power centers like royal courts, city halls, or battlefields were exclusively male domains, utterly distinct from any female activity. However, for many medieval women, the domestic sphere was not a private refuge, but a crucial economic and administrative unit that was deeply intertwined with public power. For noble women, managing a large household was itself a significant undertaking that required complex administrative and economic skills. These households were often vast, encompassing numerous servants, agricultural workers, and sometimes even small garrisons. The lady of the manor was responsible for managing the finances of the household, overseeing supplies, directing agricultural production, and maintaining the infrastructure of the estate. When her husband was away on crusade, at war, or attending the royal court, the noblewoman effectively became the de facto ruler of the entire estate. This involved collecting rents, administering justice in local courts, ensuring the loyalty of vassals, and even defending the castle against attacks. These were not merely domestic duties, they were acts of governance that directly impacted the economic and political stability of the region, placing her squarely in a position of power. Women also actively participated in what might be considered early forms of local governance and social welfare. In many medieval communities, women played key roles in managing communal resources, such as mills or ovens, and in organizing mutual aid networks. Her guilds, while often dominated by men, also had female members, particularly in trades like textiles, brewing, and baking. Women master craftswomen ran their own workshops, employed apprentices, and contributed to the economic regulations of their specific trades. These roles were not confined to the home. They involved public interactions, commercial transactions, and adherence to civic rules, integrating women into the wider urban economy and contributing to the economic power of their towns. They engaged in city markets, ran taverns, and operated businesses that were central to the life of the community. Moreover, the lines between the domestic and the political were often blurred in the medieval period. The royal courts, for instance, were both the king's household and the center of national government. Queens, even if not regents, held significant influence within these hybrid spaces. They managed the royal household, which was itself a massive administrative undertaking, but also hosted diplomats, received petitioners, and acted as patrons of arts and letters. Their social networks and patronage could influence appointments, legislation, and diplomatic relations. A queen's presence at court, her participation in ceremonies, and her role in mediating disputes within the nobility were all public acts that directly contributed to the functioning of the central government. She was not separate from the power center, she was a vital component of it, even if her role was often framed in terms of household management. In the legal realm, women were often active participants in public courts, even if their roles were different from men's. The records from manorial courts, borough courts, and even royal courts show women appearing as plaintiffs, defendants, witnesses, and even occasionally as jurors, particularly in cases involving other women. They brought lawsuits over property disputes, debt, defamation, and violence, directly engaging with the formal legal structures of their time. These court appearances were public events, requiring women to assert their rights and voices in a formal setting. Their ability to navigate the legal system, to represent their interests, and to seek justice directly contradicts the idea of their complete confinement to a private, silent sphere. Their involvement demonstrates a practical engagement with the machinery of power that directly impacted their lives and the lives of those around them. The management of religious institutions by women also directly challenges the notion of their confinement to the domestic. Abbesses, as discussed in previous sections, governed vast monastic complexes that were economic powerhouses, complete with agricultural lands, tenant populations, and sometimes even fortification. The administrative duties extended far beyond spiritual guidance to include large-scale economic management, political negotiation with secular lords, and the church hierarchy, and the provision of social services. These were not domestic roles, they were complex administrative and political responsibilities that placed women at the head of significant institutions that were powerful actors in the public life of their regions. Their abbeys were centers of learning, charity, and often political influence, making their sphere of operation decidedly public and influential, not merely domestic. Number one, medieval women were completely devoid of any political voice. This notion is perhaps the most sweeping and ultimately the most inaccurate of all. It suggests that women in the medieval period were entirely voiceless in matters of governance, utterly excluded from any form of decision-making, opinion-shaping, or power-wielding in the public realm. It implies that their perspectives were never sought, their needs never addressed, and their presence never registered in the grand narratives of political history. This idea often stems from a limited understanding of what constitutes political voice in a pre-modern context, assuming it only means formal office holding or direct legislative power, which was indeed rare for women. It overlooks the myriad ways in which power operated in the medieval world through custom, economic leverage, social networks, legal advocacy, and the sheer force of personality and how women navigated and exploited these avenues. It paints a picture of a silent, invisible female population completely disconnected from the engines of power. However, even a brief look at the historical record reveals a multitude of instances where medieval women possessed, exercised, and asserted a political voice in diverse ways and across various social strata. Their queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile, wielded immense political power as regents and rulers, not just through their husbands, but in their own right. Eleanor, as Duchess of Aquitaine, governed a territory larger than the French king's own domain, issuing charters, collecting taxes, and administering justice. Blanche, as regent of France, crushed rebellions, negotiated peace treaties, and secured the kingdom's borders. Their voices were the voice of the crown heard across the kingdom and beyond, directing policy and commanding armies. These were not whispers in private, but booming proclamations from the very highest political office, demonstrating direct and public political voice. Beyond royalty, powerful abbesses of imperial abbeys, such as Matilda of Quedlinburg, regularly attended imperial diets. In these assemblies, the most powerful secular and ecclesiastical lords of the Holy Roman Empire gathered to debate policy, make laws, and decide the fate of the realm. The abbesses participated in these discussions, advised emperors, and used their institutional power to influence outcomes. They were recognized as significant feudal lords, their voices carrying weight due to their vast landholdings, wealth, and the spiritual authority of their positions. Their political voice was not just heard, but formally acknowledged within the highest legislative and advisory bodies of the empire, contradicting any idea of voicelessness. Noblewomen, in their capacity as landowners and castle defenders, frequently exercised direct political and military authority. When their husbands were away on crusade or at war, women like Nicola de la Haye, who famously defended Lincoln Castle against repeated sieges in the early 13th century, effectively held military command. Her decision to defend the castle, her organization of the garrison, and her negotiation with besiegers were all direct and undeniable expressions of political and military voice, crucial to the outcome of conflicts and the stability of the region. These actions were not hidden, but played out in the public eye, impacting the fate of significant strongholds and their surrounding territories. In urban centers, women, particularly widows or unmarried women, often managed substantial businesses, owning property, employing workers, and contributing significantly to the city's economy. Wealthy merchant women often had a voice in local civic affairs through their economic leverage and social networks. They could influence trade regulations, contribute to city projects, and exert pressure on city councils. Their records show women appearing in town courts to conduct business, settle disputes, and defend their rights, indicating a recognized legal standing and an active participation in the local political and legal systems. Their economic clout provided a real, tangible political voice in shaping the daily life and governance of their communities. Even intellectually, women asserted their political voice. As Christine de Pizan, an early 15th century writer, dedicated her works to defending women and providing political commentary and advice to rulers. Her Book of the City of Ladies challenged deeply entrenched misogynistic views, while the Book of Peace offered specific guidance on good governance to the French Dauphin. Her writings were commissioned by nobles and royalty, widely circulated, and intended to influence public opinion and policy. Her ability to earn a living through her writing and to engage in public discourse, offering opinions on matters of state, clearly demonstrates a powerful and articulate political voice that transcended conventional boundaries. Finally, in the legal sphere, women often appeared in court as plaintiffs, defendants, and witnesses, demonstrating agency and a recognized legal voice. They initiated lawsuits to protect their property, defend their honor, or seek justice for wrongs committed against them. The manorial court rolls, for example, are filled with women participating in local governance, asserting their rights, and contributing to the customary laws that govern village life. Their ability to speak for themselves in a formal legal setting, to be heard, and to have their testimony considered, shows that their voices were not entirely absent from the mechanisms of power, but were acknowledged and given weight within the medieval justice system. These varied examples across centuries and social strata illustrate that medieval women, far from being voiceless, found and forged numerous ways to make their political presence felt.